Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Left Lens. We have a very special guest today. I hope you all had a good weekend. We have Richard Medhurst. Needs no introduction. He's here with me for about an hour, maybe a little bit more if we can do that. You all know Richard from his channel over on YouTube, Rockfin, elsewhere. Richard, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, bro. It's good to be here, Danny. I've been we just got a new prime minister in the UK like about an hour ago, so I'm dying to get into this. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to open with this because I mean, what it's felt like since Boris Johnson resigned, and even a bit before that, was that there was a musical chairs of prime ministers coming. And of course, this comes in the context of something you've been speaking a lot about, which is this crisis that's befallen Europe, given this proxy war on Russia, this NATO-led proxy war, US-led proxy war. Yeah, what is your reaction to this? Because Liz Truss, she had this mini budget. She wanted to cut taxes massively. You would think that the rich would really like that. But she also was a really just an outright hawk, right? She labeled China the biggest threat to the UK. She wanted to escalate with Russia. But what is your reaction to her? It's about 44, 45 days and she's gone. It's the fastest that any prime minister has been ousted. What do you have to say about this, given that you spent a lot of time in London yourself?
Yeah, I mean, she's a joke. What can I say? I mean, she was foreign minister before she became prime minister. It's like you said, musical chairs. They just take each other's jobs. You'll have someone who's the health secretary, then they become the foreign secretary, and then they're the prime minister, and then they'll before that they'll been the chancellor or something. It's just like they're jumping from one field to the next, not because they're qualified for that, but because their buddies are giving them the job. It's like a cabal or a gang or whatever, a mafia. Boris Johnson himself, before he was prime minister, he used to be the mayor of London, then he was foreign secretary. It's just they're not suited for these jobs, right? And I think it's really important to point out that Liz Truss was not elected by the British people. Rishi Sunak, who's now the prime minister, was also not elected by the British people. They're basically they hold these leadership contests in the party. So because the Tories won the last general election in late 2020, late 2019. I forget now, I'm a bit fuzzy. It was when they screwed Corbyn. It was in December, and since then, basically, because they have the mandate, they can inside the party, relegate the choice of prime minister to like a few thousand or 100,000 people. And the funny thing is with Sunak, they didn't even have the contest. Like I've never seen this. Like there's this rival. The only person running against him was Penny Mordaunt. She dropped out. And Boris Johnson, he was slated to run again, and then he withdrew his candidacy. He dropped out too. So there was no contest. He was just like handed the job. I'll get to him in a second. But with Liz Truss, I mean, she's like you said, she's trying to stoke tensions with China and with Ukraine. I think it's important to remember Boris Johnson. Just back this summer, he went to Zelensky and told him like, don't take any peace deal with the Russians. I don't know what he told him. Exactly, like we're going to back you up, or if you do this, we'll do that. But basically, the message was clear: you don't do any peace negotiations with the Russians. And so you see again how, they want this war to continue, even though it's screwing people at home. I mean, Liz Truss with her economic plan, she had Kwasi Kwarteng, who was the chancellor, and they came up with this so-called mini budget. Okay, now I know people want to blame it on the mini budget. But it's not just the mini budget; it's also the war in Ukraine. So these things coupled together are what caused the pound to fall so much, right? So I've never seen it this bad. I think the last time it was like in the 1970s, so I wasn't even alive. It's really like that embarrassing. The euro and the pound are going down, and meanwhile the ruble is up. Ruble's best performing currency this year. So what does that tell you? That tells you this whole economic war, they messed with the wrong one this time. They thought Russia is Syria, or Russia is Iran, or Russia is Venezuela. No, Russia's economy is, intertwined with the European economy. They're interdependent. And when you start messing with Russia, you're going to screw Europe as well. Even though the UK, for example, doesn't get a whole ton of gas from or oil from Russia, neither does the US, but it still affects the global economy. And in the UK, energy prices there's a cap that's imposed by the regulator on how much you can pay. That the cap has been lifted 80%, 80. So people are having to shut down their businesses because they can't pay the energy bills. And that's something you see all over Europe. In France and Germany, they've had to nationalize the energy companies like Uniper and Énergie de France, EDF. So like they're so broke, they've gone so bust, the government has had to come in and buy everything. And in the UK, it's very bad. They like to call it cost of living crisis, or in the US, it's Putin's price hike. No, man, this is blowback from economic warfare against Russia. This is what it is. Like I always used to joke to myself, like they're going to sanction so many countries one day, they're going to start sanctioning themselves. And this is kind of what happened.
Kind of it,
although it's not funny, of course. You know why? Because the people that suffer are not the politicians. Like if the price of fuel goes up 5 times, they're not paying for the fuel in the first place. It's taxpayers, and Liz Truss, she leaves office now. And she, for the rest of her life, she's going to get £115,000 a year in what they call allowance for 44 days. I mean, honestly, if she was there 400 days, she still wouldn't deserve it. But you see how the game is rigged. Like she'll probably get some lobbying job and get even more money than that. But the fact that she's entitled to this after just 44 days in office is outrageous. It's outrageous. And people, meanwhile, can't even afford to pay the electricity bills. They can't buy food. They can't, fill their tanks. That's ridiculous. And Rishi Sunak is. I'm gonna coin this new term. He's British Obama. Okay, this guy is British Obama, because now they're celebrating that. Oh, he's the first brown prime minister, the first non-white prime minister, and he's of Indian descent. And since India was a British colony and we committed a lot of atrocities there, this is good, right? Okay, I put it to you then. Why don't we have a Palestinian prime minister? Palestinians are still suffering to this day from what Britain did, but they don't care about that. They're just doing this to play these identity politics. But if you look at Sunak, who he is, there's this video that resurfaced a few months ago of him like bragging that he has aristocrat friends, he has upper class friends, and then he says, I have working class friends. And he's like, well, actually, no, I don't have any working class friends, but I talk to them and, I'll tell them I was at Winchester College. And like, it's really embarrassing because you can see how smug he is. It's like 20 years ago. Right. And he worked at Goldman Sachs. Okay. So he's, he comes from a partnership with a huge hedge fund. He's worked at Goldman Sachs, which, I mean, I don't, is one of the most corrupt institutions on earth, huge banking group. And, it's interesting because in the last months, we saw a couple of other scandals on the side. Like he had a green card in the US for some reason while being chancellor in the UK. Green card is permanent residency in the US. How are you residing in the US when you're working as a chancellor in the UK? Like there's something off. And he only renounced it after people found out last year. And then another thing that I would add is with his wife. When he was chancellor, he's basically raising taxes on British people. So I think the highest since 1940, right? Since World War II. And at the same time, his wife, who's a billionaire, is getting these enormous tax breaks because she's registered as what you call non-domicile. So she's Indian, and she has a stake in Infosys, which is an Indian IT company. I believe it's her father's, and she's like a 0.9% stake in there. And so she was basically, if you look at the books, she was making like 11 million pounds a year in dividends and not paying any tax on that in the UK because she was registered under non-domicile, which is like this old thing from the 18th century. And so, like she and Sunak, this couple, they're stinking rich. I think he himself, he's worth 700 million pounds. So they're stinking rich, and they know how to take advantage of how to game the system and make rules for themselves and their friends, while raising raising costs for average people, whether it's a blowback from the sanctions or their own policies. Because in spring, he tried he put out a plan to help people in the UK, but it actually just made things worse. Like I said, it's the highest tax rate since the 1940s. So it's incredible to me that we have a guy who comes from the banking sector who's stinking rich. His wife is stinking rich. They're gaming the legal system and the financial system in the US, in the UK, and we're supposed to celebrate that like it's some kind of revolutionary thing that we have the first a brown prime minister or non-white prime minister. The guy's white from his behavior. Look at who he works for. Look at where he worked. Look at who he serves. Just because he went to Winchester College, that's not the issue. I don't care where he went to school. After he went to school, what was he doing then? He's working for Goldman Sachs. He's gaming the system. So that shows you, you can tell from his behavior, from his record, who he is and who he serves, and the powers that he serves are white European capitalist powers. As simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison of to Obama, is interesting because I was speaking with a friend of the show, Carlos Martinez, and he was talking about Boris Johnson had this trajectory, years ago. He was friendly with China. He was a little more stable. He didn't have this like quote unquote Trump demeanor, and then he adopted it when it became politically, politically viable and attractive. Now you had Liz Truss, who seemed like, someone that's kind of off the rails almost, like a complete and utter reflection of this political crisis.
Yeah.
And she had to go. She had to go because not even this obvious oligarchic political party could stomach the possible consequences of what would happen should she have stayed. And now you have someone who, it seems like the elite, it seems like the actual oligarchs, and we should normalize talking about the UK and the US as that, an oligarchy.
Yeah.
It seems like they're gambling on Sunak as perhaps a stable political force in a moment of just utter instability. But you said it, and maybe you could speak more about this too. Europe, the UK, yes, there was Brexit. Well, yeah, okay. But at the same time, it is intimately connected with the rest of Europe, how the situation is going with the rest of Europe. And you said it too. The UK is very much invested in this war in Ukraine, so much so that it was acting as the US's lapdog and preventing peace.
Yeah.
And it's probably done that many more times that we don't know, but we know in April, that's exactly what was happening. And now we're seeing the consequences. And this is kind of a historic moment because I myself too have never lived through a period where the euro and this formation, the EU, this like post-Soviet formation that was supposed to kind of stabilize and integrate Europe on behalf of capital, never seen it so unstable, so really unraveling. And it's happening politically quite rapidly, but people are getting hurt. These sanctions, this is also unprecedented too. It used to be that Venezuela could be sanctioned, Syria could be sanctioned, and Americans and people across Europe don't really care, maybe don't even know about it, but don't really care because it doesn't affect their economic situation. Now it's the exact opposite, and we're seeing the warmongering get so heightened that even Elon Musk, someone who's providing Starlink, this a satellite surveillance service to the Ukrainian military for free.
Yeah.
Perhaps he's coming under U.S. investigation because he not only said, "Hey, I'm a capitalist. I want to get paid. Like this is going on forever," and then saying maybe we need a settlement. Probably because he's not getting paid. He's of course reversed that position. But anyway, any reactions to any of that?
Yeah, that was insane with Musk. I'm no fan of his, but I found that interesting when he said that there should be a peace settlement, and they immediately said like, oh, you're a Putin puppet and you're just repeating Russian talking points, and then some Ukrainian diplomat told him to F off, and then they were like Starlink wasn't working for a few days, and then they accused him of even more of working for Putin, and then he reversed the position, like you said. So now he's giving them Starlink for free, and they're still investigating him. Like I think that that kind of shows you, no matter how rich you are, if you step out of line with the establishment, like they can come for you. It's not like they're all rich. They're all rich, right? Like why do they mess with him more than Jeff Bezos? Maybe because Jeff Bezos just keeps his mouth shut. I don't know. But it's an interesting lesson for sure. And when it comes to Sunak, it's a sort of like, I'll say this. I do think he's going to bring stability for people in the city. So when I say city, I mean the city of London, which is the financial capital of the UK. So this is City of London is a very interesting place, by the way. They have their own police force. So can you imagine you're in New York and you go to a district and there's like one, not even a borough. It's smaller than a borough. It's just like 1 square kilometer that has its own police force, and all the banks are in there. Like, what does that tell you? Imagine Wall Street had their own police
Yeah,
force
it's like
outside
if
the
it's like
NYPD.
this. Yep, exactly.
Right. So and by the way, so St. Paul's Cathedral is also there, and the court, the Old Bailey, where I was reporting on Assange, is also in the city of London. So the the criminal, the highest criminal court, well, bar the High Court and Supreme Court, but the Criminal Court of England and Wales is also located there. So they have the power of a church, the judiciary, and the financial system concentrated in this tiny area, which is very, very, shady. And I think it speaks volumes. So Rishi Sunak comes from this place, right? Like, and he worked for Goldman Sachs, but you can walk around City of London and, you'll find all these other banks, British banks, HSBC, who, they have like people who ran the bank 200 years ago who own slaves. There's not one of these banks that was not built on blood money. Every single one of them was either participating in slavery, basically lending money to slave owners in the U.S., or the governor of the bank had his own slaves. Like, it's completely, disgusting. And so again, you have to keep this in mind when you say, okay, he's the first non-white prime minister. Yeah, but who is he working for? Who is he benefiting? He's not going to benefit people from India or people of color. He's going to benefit the elites, who are mostly and largely white, but it's more of a class thing than anything else, right? So don't get sucked into that and think it's about color. They don't see color, ironically. I find that funny, right? Because the guys at the top, the elite, they've kind of managed to like overcome the color thing, and it's more about money and class now. So they'll be happy to have someone like Obama or someone like Sunak in power, as long as they play ball, right? They're okay with that now. But don't be fooled by it. This guy, he's gonna, the only people that are gonna sleep easy at night are the people running the banks, and the elite. So if you're working class or you're middle class, prices, I don't know if they're gonna come down. I really don't think that's something they can just manage easily now. It's out of hand. And what the US is doing is basically deindustrializing Europe. They've blown up Nord Stream 1 and 2. That's gone. Even if you want to believe it's the Russians, I don't believe that. But if even, let's say it was the Russians, it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, Europe is going to need to get gas from somewhere else. And, the United States is stepping up and offering LNG, liquefied natural gas, at 4 or 5 times the price. So you're going to have companies, and I've covered this extensively. You have glass makers in France. You have the steel industry in Germany. A lot of these companies just cannot afford to keep the furnaces and the lights on. So they have to shut down. And if they have a bit of money, move to the US. So you got both European companies moving to the US and European companies buying American gas. And while America benefits from that, which is why the dollar has not, crashed like the euro and the pound, it's still not good for people in America. I always ask my viewers, like, how much they're paying for gas. It would be good if people listening right now would type in the comments how much they're paying for gas in their state. But it's usually $3, $4, $5 a gallon, which is excessive and insane. And in Europe, it's going to get a whole lot worse, I think, because, like I said, they're deindustrializing it. And Sunak has no interest, nor is he capable of stopping that. It's gone too far now with Russia. It's gone too far.
Yeah.
And you know this just as well as I. Russia can turn east. Russia can turn to China. The future is China. The future is the Belt and Road Initiative. What future does the West have? There's nothing there. There's nothing there. They wanted to play tough guy, tough cowboy, shooting sanctions at everyone, and now it's blowing up in their faces. But like I said, unfortunately, it doesn't hit the politicians who put up the sanctions. It hits just average people who probably don't even know what sanctions are. And then you can really talk about a class issue there once again, right? It's working class people on both sides that are paying the price. And there was one more thing I wanted to say about Sunak. I forgot what it was now, but it'll come back to me in a second. But yeah, that's the gist of it.
Yeah, and what you were saying about the blowback of this is so, I think, just important, because you have the Europe, all of Europe, the European Union, basically committing economic suicide, and you have the United States really, at least in terms of the oligarchs, the capitalists, those forces you said are not so concerned in totality, in the main, with perhaps the more superficial kind of racial politics that we see in the mainstream, but they are really interested in creating a state of subservience for not just the global south anymore, but all of Europe as well. And this is
Oh
mainly
yeah.
the US oligarchs. It's just that as junior partners, Europe seems to have absolutely no backbone. The competition that's inherent, I mean, competition is inherent in this game, in this capitalist game, but it seems like they're willing to become servants in the whole to the United States in order to keep this war on Russia going. And I've been saying that it's because the end goal around Ukraine is more important than short-term profits right now. And so, while of course U.S. LNG, the military-industrial complex, they're running away with massive profits in the short term, not only is the EU basically already in a recession and the inflation is out of control, but the US is also in a very similar position in inflation wise. And now you have JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, you have these big banks, Bank of America, basically those who run the United States uh, entirely. They are saying that actually the United States is headed toward a formal economic crisis, a recession, probably in the next 6 to 12 months. And what that will mean is that, similar to what's happening in Europe, there will be massive job losses and there will be massive consequences to what is happening. And the hope is that, I think the hope is that the suffering imposed on Europe and the global south too, because the global south has to pay pretty mightily for these sanctions, that they will suffer so much that it will help carry the United States. And I think Joe Biden is thinking that, the Democrats are thinking that it'll help carry them past election cycles so they can just get past it before basically the shit hits the fan. That's what it feels like. But the problem is that the banks have already the Federal Reserve and now all the banks have increased the interest rates, and that really sends the capitalist economy into a free fall, because that means investment and the necessary consuming that needs to happen for this glut in the housing market or any market, energy, everything, it stops. And that's what's happening. It's starting to stop. So to me, it's just incredible that this is happening, because it does feel like, despite all of you know, Obama on Pod Save America, you have Biden, everyone, right? Liz Truss before she was gone, everyone was bragging. Finland's prime minister, all of them are like, Ukraine is winning. We're winning. We're on the right side. We're a democracy. And everything is saying the opposite. Could you talk about that? Because everything is saying the opposite about this whole notion of victory. Ukraine's taken back. Ukraine has had territory now stripped from it. Russia has been able to successfully use referendums after its defense of Donbass to take, 20, 25%. You have this mobilization happening, and it's probably going to really reap dividends come this late fall, winter. And Russia is the one, right? Russia's the one calling about things like dirty bombs. They're the ones saying, hey, UK, France, you should be worried about what Ukraine is doing, because they're trying to drag you further into something you can't win. That doesn't sound like a position of weakness. I want to know your opinion about where Russia stands and this whole notion of victory that the United States and NATO countries, especially the EU countries, just are touting over and over and over again.
Yeah. Just a quick note before I forget, because you mentioned interest rates, because of this, I know they say it's the mini budget. It wasn't just a mini budget, but because of the pound, going into free fall, basically, you have people who were, slated to get a mortgage or a loan from a bank so they can buy a house or an apartment, and the interest rates are now like 10%, and you have people that are locked into like a 20, 30-year mortgage at 10%, because of these clowns, and once again, it shows you who's paying the price for their, I don't know, is it subservience? Like you said, I certainly think so to an extent, the way that Europe is kind of like just blindly following orders from the oligarchs in the US. It's really, it's pathetic and degrading and embarrassing, like if these politicians, and I don't think a lot of them, I don't think a lot of them are going to be around come, next year, this time, but if they had any self-respect or backbone, they wouldn't be just, blindly following all this crap. Like when Biden was standing in giving this press conference about Nord Stream 2. This is 2 days before the war started, right? It's February 22nd. And he's standing next to Olaf Scholz, who's the German chancellor. And he's like speaking for him. He's saying like, we're going to shut Nord Stream 2 down. And even the reporter is like, what the heck? Like, that's a German project and Russian project. It's not American. And then he's like, oh, believe me, we'll do it. So like that was extremely degrading and embarrassing and shameful and humiliating. And it shows you how the United States is just like towering over Germany and the rest of Europe, like literally standing next to the guy, and he's like speaking for his whole country. That's extremely powerful in terms of a symbol, right, of the relationship and the dynamic. And this idea that they're somehow victorious. I mean, there is not going to be any viable victory here. I know that they have abandoned diplomacy, so that leaves them with total defeat, right? That seems what they're going for. They want a total defeat of Russia. That's not happening. It's just not happening. Russia is certainly okay. It's not the Soviet Union, but Russia still has a lot of paths, a lot of opportunities to explore. Again, I'll remind people, Russia has the largest proven reserves of natural gas. Iran has the second. Like, these countries have shown that under sanctions, under immense, extraordinary stress, they're able to innovate, they're able to find alternatives, and they're looking eastward. There's a whole bond, there's a whole relationship, there's a whole era, an entire age, a true age in the East that is yet to come. It hasn't even begun yet. We're right on the precipice of Belt and Road Initiative and all of this massive revival of the Silk Road, right, which is a beautiful thing. And all this trade and economic growth and multipolarism that is yet to come. So if you think you're just going to defeat Russia and destroy that country and game over, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen like this. And the problem is, though, that a lot of people are going to suffer in Europe before they even realize what their politicians did to them. Okay. And you're seeing in Europe a lot of people protesting that they are slowly starting to understand that these sanctions, number one, they don't work. And number two, there's a blowback from the sanctions, and they're thinking to themselves, well, this is not worth it. I just don't care about Zelensky that much. I really don't care enough about Ukraine for me not to be able to, pay for my business, etc. And the thing with Ukraine, you mentioned Donbass, and, Blinken, he goes to the United Nations at the Security Council and the GA, the General Assembly. They've been trying to pass these resolutions to condemn Russia. They were able to do that in the GA, but then in the Security Council, Russia vetoed it. But Blinken, he was speaking there, and he said something about how, if we allow this kind of behavior where one country can just annex part of another country, then it opens the door to other countries doing it. And I'm shocked, because I agree with him for once. But what he didn't say is that he is the one, and the United States is the one that opened this door. So if you want to criticize Russia about annexing these 4 regions in Ukraine, you can't do that from his position, because it's hypocritical. And it's not just the US, it's literally Blinken himself, like that same guy. When he just became Secretary of State, he just had been nominated by Biden. He goes on CNN with Wolf Blitzer, and Blitzer asked him, I was surprised he would ask this. I thought they'd just sweep it under the rug. But he asked him, the Trump administration, they moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that, of course, is very, aggressive, because it kind of signals that the U.S. accepts Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which is something the UN is against, right? The UN has always said that Jerusalem should be, because it's so important for Muslims, Christians, Jews, it should be its own entity, right? Corpus separatum. So in Latin, it just means separate body. So it doesn't belong to anyone because of its special status as a holy city. So they violated that, right? And they violated multiple resolutions, Resolution 242, where the UN Security Council, even the US at the time, voted for this, that Israel has to get out of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Syrian Golan Heights. And then Trump, as I said, in addition to Jerusalem, he goes to the Syrian Golan Heights, which have been occupied by Israel since 1967, and says, this is not Syria anymore, this is Israel. And then, in the State Department, they're redrawing maps, right, to say that the Golan Heights are Israeli. And there's no country on earth except the US that has this position. The whole world knows that the Golan Heights are Syrian. The Security Council, everything. And Trump changes that. And of course, Mike Pompeo is his Secretary of State. Who succeeds Mike Pompeo? Blinken, right? We have Biden and Blinken. And Wolf Blitzer asks Blinken, are you going to change this position? Are you going to recognize the Golan Heights as Syrian once again? And he says no. And the way he starts the sentence, he says, like, legalities aside. So, like, you're talking about international law and you start the sentence with legalities aside? What do you mean? Legalities are the whole point. It's a legal issue. It's not legalities aside. And then Blinken, what he says is, we're going to continue to view the Golan Heights as Israeli as long as Bashar al-Assad is the president in Syria. So they're basically saying we're holding this territory ransom until we get a leader, a puppet that we want and we like in Syria. So I find it very difficult to listen to Blinken barely a year later coming and saying that, oh, it's not okay to annex other people's territory. And keep in mind, Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1980 and never held a referendum, right? They say the referendums in Donbass were a sham. There was no referendum in the Golan Heights. They just took that shit. And on top of it, Naftali Bennett, who was just the previous Israeli prime minister, he gets in office and he says that he wants to double the illegal settlements in the Golan Heights. So, you know, in Donbass, you can make the argument at least that this is self-determination because the people there are actually Russian and they want to be Russian. In the Golan Heights, there are no Israelis. There are no Israelis that they have to come and illegally build settlements to kind of legitimize it, which is what they did in all over Palestine, right? So it's apples to oranges, really. But when you look at the U.S. position on one annexation and then another, they're fine with it. So, you know, the French, the British, like, we've redrawn maps a million times. We did it in Africa. We did it in, there was the Berlin Conference. Then we did the Sykes-Picot in 1916, and we carved up Syria, and we carved up, into Jordan, Lebanon, and then promised the Jewish settlers Israel in 1917. We've been redrawing borders for centuries, and now we have a problem when Russia does it. You know, this is very important because when it's the West who is presenting and portraying itself as the moral arbiter, and saying we have to respect international norms and rules-based order. They always say that. They don't say international law. They say rules-based order. And they behave like this for centuries. We can't accept this when they turn around and want to lecture the Russians. It just doesn't work. And like I said, the arguments that the Russians make, you can't even make them in the case of the Golan Heights or the West Bank, or, you just can't. So I think the issue with Donbass, with these four regions that were annexed, so that's Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk and Donetsk, there has to be an actual effort by the UN to examine what the people there want, because I understand on one hand people say, oh, well, people didn't vote there because they either fled because of the war, or, they made this argument that, there were Russian soldiers coming door to door. There's one video.
Oh, the New York Times. I showed it here where the New York Times claimed that, they interviewed some random person saying that that Russian forces were holding them at gunpoint while they were voting.
They said the same thing in Syria. When there was an election last year, they said the Secret Service, the Mukhabarat, would come and watch people, at the voting booth, like some cartoon comic book.
Cartoonish.
Yeah, like they say this all the time. Every time there's any form of polling or election or any kind of democratic activity in a country that they hate, they call the results before it's even taken place. Mm-hmm. In Iran, they said before the election, we don't accept the results. In Syria, we don't accept the results. So there's nothing, you can't do anything to please the West. And I don't know why anyone would want to please them. Like, who the fuck are they? You don't go ask Syria's opinion about American elections and if they were held, according to democratic standards. You know why? Because Syria doesn't get into those affairs. And ironically, I mean, the irony here is that they want regime change in Russia, they want regime change in Iran, they want regime change in Venezuela, in Syria. If those countries meddled in U.S. affairs, I'm not saying they should, but if they did, you could even say that it's self-defense because the U.S. has been meddling in their affairs for decades. They're trying to get, they want to get U.S. boots off their soil. You have 1/3 of Syria occupied by the U.S. Why isn't anyone complaining about that? Like,
no referendum. I was gonna say no referendum there. Where's the referendum for that?
And they try to promote separatism in Syria with the Kurds. So the U.S. are with the Kurds. That's, of course, when they're not stabbing them in the back, which they do a lot. But the Americans, for now, are with the Kurds, and they're in northeastern Syria. And the Kurds, obviously they want their own country there. The problem is, though, that this is like the oil-rich region of Syria. It's the breadbasket region, and there are U.S. forces on all the bases. They have built bases on all the oil fields, so Ahmad oil fields, and in Hasakeh. And so, like separatism is okay there, and separatism is okay with Uyghurs in China. Like, and Taiwan is also okay. So you see the hypocrisy, right? Like they're fine when it annoys China or annoys Syria. Separatism is fine. But then when people in Donbass want that, they say it's Russian imperialism. Russian imperialism. What is this, 1916? Like, all of a sudden the New York Times, they have this word in their vocabulary, imperialism. I never heard you say that with the US or the UK.
Right.
What is this? They suddenly had an awakening? Come on, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy is so stark. I mean, I was going to bring up if you didn't, but thankfully, yeah, this is a great transition to talk about Syria and Iran a little deeper, because, yeah, the U.S. is occupying Syria. I mean, like a colonial power occupies militarily, without any sort of mandate or any sort of interest in consulting and in cooperating with the rightful government of Syria and its people. Forget about people, forget about government. The U.S. is occupying Syria, stealing its oil, doing all sorts of other things, trying to destabilize the government.
Can I just add, Danny? Yeah. We should remember Israel is occupying the Syrian Golan Heights in the south. Yes. Turkey is occupying Idlib in northern Syria, and the United States is to the east in Hasakeh and Deir ez-Zor, so east of the Euphrates River. So we're occupied by 3 countries. 2 of them are NATO members, and they want to talk about illegal invasions and annexations. Get the hell out of here!
Right, and the U.S. And its allies and their corporate oligarch control media, they rely on just the silence and erasure on this question of Syria. So let's get to Syria then, because you are still covering it. And back in 2013, 14, I mean, we go back to 2011, but 2012, 13, 14, 15, all the way into 2016, which was this really, I think, climactic moment where the resistance was very successful in a lot of ways. You had this occupation happen, and then you've had basically not a lot of conversations about what's going on, but you still have Israel bombing. What is it? Every other day, it seems like, bombing Damascus and surrounding areas. And you still have this proxy war happening against Syria. Syria's never been able to say, okay, we're able to let our guard down. We can finally actually rebuild. These sanctions plus this looting of oil. What is it? 80% of all of Syria's oil is being robbed and plundered, mainly by the United States, shipping it to Iraq and giving it to Turkey. All of this, robbing Syria to the point where its economy is much smaller, and the people are suffering more than they've ever had since it seems like the colonial period. Since then, why do you think Syria is not being talked about right now? And what is its connection? Because you brought it up. Syria and Iran, these countries don't play ball with U.S. imperialism, with Zionism, with Europe's vassalage to the American empire. What explains? Do you think that explains why Syria is just not really talked about anymore? What is your opinion on that?
It's funny, because when the French were occupying Syria, they at least put up a bullshit show of pretending it's a mandate. The Americans are just there, and like you said, they're stealing the oil. They move it through this border crossing at Al Walid, and the U.S. actually, they also have another base. If you go down to the south in Syria. This is very important. It's called Al Tanaf, and it's basically at the intersection between the Syrian border, the Jordanian border, and the Iraqi border. So very, very, very strategic. And they have an air base there, right? They have a whole air base. And, the reason they don't talk about Syria is because Syria is part of the resistance axis. This comes from George Bush, like his speechwriter, David Frum. came up with this term axis of evil, right? And he was like talking about basically any country that won't open its economy to American multinationals and banks. And, you know, included like North Korea and Iran and Syria and Iraq and so on, right? So if you want to be independent, you're evil, apparently. And there's a guy who took this term and he flipped it on its head and turned it into axis of resistance, because they're resisting Zionism and European and Western colonialism, right? And it's like you said, the U.S. presence in Syria, it is literally no different from, like, you go back 100 years to the Ottomans or to the French. There's no difference. They're just there and they're occupying it, right? And stealing and plundering the resources and playing God over people. And, you know, of course, they're not going to talk about Syria, because everything they're accusing Russia of doing in Ukraine, they have been doing to Syria and surrounding countries for centuries, right? So it's, I know most people perhaps don't notice because the media are so good at blindsiding them and you know, and brainwashing people into not caring. But Israel, for example, they're bombing Syria every other week. In the last months, they destroyed Damascus International Airport. So this is a civilian airport, and you know, I've flown through there. I don't know how many times, like too many to count. And I saw the photos, and it's very heartbreaking, and it's very vindictive and malicious. You can look at the satellite pictures, and you can see like the runway, the main runway. They've blown it up in perfect in 3 perfect increments to completely disable it. So you can't use it from the top or the bottom. Nothing. It's just gone. And then of course they say that, you know, the Israelis, they don't say anything because, you know, they don't want to come out and admit that they're bombing Syria and doing things that are illegal, that are acts of war. So the press will do this for them, whether it's Israeli or American or European press. They'll come out and justify for them. So they'll say alleged Israeli strikes, like as if who was it? Tanzania? Of course it was fucking Israel. Israel allegedly struck Damascus, and then they'll say Iranian shipments of weapons, right? So they'll justify it for the Israeli government, and, like, you know, being good lapdogs, they'll do it that way, and they'll say, well, you know, Iran is bringing weapons into Syria through the international airport or whatever other place they bombed. One time it was Latakia port. They also bombed Aleppo International Airport. Aleppo is not the capital, but it's the biggest city in Syria. It's the industrial economic center, and so you got the 2 biggest airports in Syria destroyed by Israel. One of the biggest ports in Latakia destroyed. So you can see how they're crippling the economy and crippling any hopes of reconstruction. And then again, they make this argument that, oh, it's Hamas is there, Iran is there. Well, hold on a second, man. Everybody's in Ukraine right now helping them against the Russians, right? Like you can go right now and fight with the Ukrainians. You can, the British government was literally telling people, we don't mind if you go and fight in Ukraine, right? And they're sending weapons to Ukraine and giving you all sorts of aid. I don't even know how many billions they've sent by now. There's the Lend-Lease. You haven't seen that since World War II. A Lend-Lease for Ukraine. And then they've given like 50, 60 billion. I lost count. The figure is probably more than that. They have probably Black Ops shit as well. So, you know, they're giving all this weaponry and armaments and ordnance to Ukraine. But when Iran does it to Syria, they bomb Syria. When Hamas and Hezbollah are there, they bomb Syria. So I don't know, like, does that mean, like, according to the New York Times and all these outlets, does that mean it's okay for Russia to bomb Kiev International Airport? Like, is that fine then? Because just last week they were screaming that Russia's bombing the energy grid and that this is a war crime. And I'm stunned that they suddenly have these words in their vocabulary, which they've been missing for the last decades. Imperialism, war crime, crimes against humanity. Wow. Look who wised up. So, you know, this is payback. They went after Syria since 2011. Right, that's the last time I was there. It's the start of the war, and 2010, 2011, and then, you know, since then they weren't able to succeed in toppling the government because Iran stepped in, Hezbollah stepped in, and Russia stepped in. And after that, what they've been trying to do is cripple Syria with sanctions. This is like the Caesar Act, which the Trump administration put in June 2020, and then the Biden administration has continued, right? So I knew this was going to happen, and it did. Biden is stealing oil just like Trump, and Biden is sanctioning Syria just like Trump, there's no difference in policy. There's absolutely no difference. You could like show me on paper the policy without the name, and I wouldn't know who's doing this. Is it Bush? Is it Trump? Biden? Obama? I don't know. But the specific ones like the Caesar Act and the dirty war in Syria, that's been continued. Obama, Trump, and Biden. And, they're trying to do a scorched earth policy. So because they couldn't get rid of the government, now their plan is to block reconstruction. So, Lebanon, which is also under like a de facto U.S. siege and under, being held at gunpoint by the IMF, Lebanon's economy is very intertwined with Syria's economy. Beirut, the capital, is like 2-hour drive from Damascus. So, and of course, Lebanese and Syrian, we have basically the same dialect. It's almost indistinguishable, the same food, everything. And our economies are interlinked. And a lot of Syrian businesses and businessmen had their money in Lebanese banks because Syria is under sanctions. They can't use the money in a Syrian bank, right? So they would put all their stuff in Lebanon. Lebanon was able to get goods into Syria and vice versa. And so, of course, the Beirut port is also very crucial. And it was kind of like a lifeline for the Syrian economy. But now the economic crisis in Lebanon since 3 years has basically made the situation in Syria worse. And the situation in Syria has made the situation in Lebanon worse, right? So it's a very, very sad dynamic. And right now, the Lebanese are trying to get this gas field going because, the Lebanese economy really, really needs money right now. And they've discovered gas off of the coast in the Mediterranean. And there's the Karish gas fields. The Israelis, again, this is all connected to Ukraine. It's really funny. Europe wants to ban Russian oil and Russian gas, and they did. And they've had several rounds of sanctions. And December 5th, you're going to have the ban coming into effect. So they need new suppliers. Now, the Americans, they sent a delegation to Venezuela to get oil from there because they used to get oil from Venezuela. And that didn't work out. They've tried getting Iran back. Iran is in the nuclear deal. I hate when I say that by accident. Iran never left the deal. It's the U.S. that left the deal. So, but the Americans have been trying to get it signed and finalized again. So, Iran would have 100 million barrels of oil coming onto the global market. They would be able to sell their gas. Maybe that didn't work. And so now basically, Israel stepped up to the plate and thought, okay, this is a great chance for us to give them gas. And Israel likes to present itself and legitimize itself as some kind of player. And they signed a deal with Egypt and the EU to become an energy partner. The problem is, though, that the energy that they would be giving Europe is stolen from Lebanon, right? So they sent this huge ship to just extract the gas like on site and process it. And then Hezbollah said, if you take like 1 cubic meter, we will blow that ship apart. And the Israelis stepped back. And now, thankfully, there's been some diplomacy, although I find it weird why the Lebanese are doing diplomacy with Israel since they don't recognize Israel. But it's basically mediated by Hochstein, who's a U.S. envoy. And so I think this week they're going to sign this deal. And basically, they've clarified this issue of maritime borders. So that's good for Lebanon. But I know I've kind of strayed off a bit here, but it is important because you see, once again, the resources of the Middle East, whether it's Iran or Syria or Lebanon, being played with by Western actors trying to use that to leverage the situation in their favor. And very, very simple answer. The reason they're doing this to Syria is because Syria is in the axis of resistance. It refuses to recognize Israel. It's being illegally occupied by Israel. The Palestinian issue is really important for all Arab countries and all Arab people, even if their governments do otherwise, like in Morocco or Sudan or Bahrain and the UAE or the Saudis, who work with the Israelis either out in the open or under the table. The people there still do not support any sort of ties with Israel, and they support the Palestinian people very strongly. So until the Palestinians have their state and their freedom, Syria is not going to back down. It's not just about the Golan Heights. It's always been that way. And, like I said, Syria doesn't have its economy opened up to Europe, to American multinationals and banks. And so, when you do that, you don't let them come in and take advantage of your country. They blacklist you and then come for you until they can get a replacement, like they did in Iran and Guatemala, and literally too many countries to go through right now. But that's how it is. So there's the issue of Syria refusing to recognize Israel, and Syria refusing to just bow down to Western capitalism. And I would just add one more thing. Bashar al-Assad, when he became president after his father died, he was never supposed to be the president. He was in London training as an eye doctor, right? So when he became president, they loved him. Like Nancy Pelosi went to visit him in Damascus, and he was at number 10 Downing Street with Tony Blair and their wives. He went to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. He was with Prince Charles. They were trying to show this motherfucker around.
They were trying. He was a reformer. That's what they were like. Oh, he's a reformer. He's coming in to Syria to. They were like, oh, neoliberalism, maybe.
There you go. You got it.
Dream, but anyway.
Yeah, it didn't work, and that's why they turned against him and they got the knives out.
Yeah, well, speaking of knives out, speaking of regime change and the axis of resistance, that leads us to what's going on inside of Iran right now, or what I should say is being done to Iran, because over the last, how long has it been? 4 weeks, almost a month now.
Right.
There's been the story of the the young woman who died in the police station in Iran. That went so viral with all of this obvious propaganda, like these royalist propaganda, like these rich Iranians and others who live all around the West making videos. I saw people I know, like just in the neighborhood, were sharing these videos. That's how powerful this operation was, saying Iran, this regime, this dictatorship, they're oppressing women. We have to save them. We have to help them. It was like Coney 2012 all over again, right? There's this murderous person running around, arming children, and lo and behold, actually, the United States was actually helping cement that to steal oil on the African continent. But I wanted to ask you about the Iran protests, because you've been covering it. Some are calling it a regime change operation that the United States is funding, and it seems like there's a lot of evidence for that, given even you have Obama recently commenting about how he would have actually, instead of being so generous with the Iran deal, which was not so generous, but he believed it was generous, and he's like, we got to work with countries we don't like. But I would have supported the MEK more. I would have supported the so-called civil society that springs in out of Iran against the injustice of the regime. I would have done that more, because now you see the consequences. That's what he was saying in relation to the protests. What are your thoughts about these protests? How would you explain to people what we should be critically looking at here?
Okay, well, the girl, the young woman who was supposedly killed, Mahsa Amini, I don't know what to believe. I'll tell you why. Because they're saying she was beaten so badly by the police, the morality police, that she was killed. And that, if that's true, that's horrific, and whoever did that should be held accountable. Like there's no way around it. It's just that it's that simple. The thing is, so the only evidence that we have is this video, this CCTV footage, and it's a couple of different angles, and you see her collapse before anyone like touched her. There was nothing. She wasn't being beaten. She just collapsed. And then I saw the next angle. She's being carried off, and then she's put into an ambulance. That's just literally all we have. Her father said that she was beaten to death because he heard that from his son, so Mahsa's brother, and he heard that from a witness. So someone told the brother, who then told the father that she was beaten to death. But there isn't any actual evidence. And then you have the medical reports in Iran, and of course people are going to say, oh, they're doctored because it's the government. The chief coroner isn't going to say anything against the government. But in any case, they said different things. They said that she had a tumor or something when she was 8, and then the father said, no, that's not true. She's never had medical issues. So I don't know what to believe. But with the evidence here, it doesn't show her being beaten. It just doesn't. If you have a video, or someone has a video, please send it to me, because I would love to see it and to talk about that. But I don't have it. I just don't have that evidence. Now let me say something, because this protest went from the government killed an innocent civilian, which is horrific, to let's get rid of the hijab, the veil, to let's get rid of the Iranian government, down with the regime. And then this choir comes back in, the same choir which we always hear every couple of years, like, oh, the Iranian regime, the Iranian regime. And by the way, any country that calls Iran a regime, or Syria a regime, and then says that's the Biden administration, is feeding you propaganda. Okay, but the same people that have been trying to get rid of the Iranian Revolution for decades are chiming in, and I think it's really important for people to understand that Iran was couped in 1953. Okay, so they had a prime minister who's called Mossadegh, and he nationalized the oil fields. And before he did that, so he did this in the early 1950s, right? 1951. The British had discovered oil in Iran, right? There was this company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and then it became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and today it's BP, British Petroleum, which you all know. They discovered this in 1908, 1909, and they start building the first pipeline, and then they created this huge refinery in Abadan in Iran. And at the time, it was the largest refinery in the world. So they've been plundering this oil from Iran for decades and decades and screwing them with the books. So they were basically, they were cooking the books to screw the Iranians out of basically paying them taxes. It's kind of like what we Britain did in India. Like people love saying, oh, we built them railroads. No. We built those railroads to plunder their resources, and then we made them pay for the trains. We made the Indians pay for the railway and the trains, which were built in Britain, so that they paid to be plundered by us. And it's the same thing in Iran. The British government was screwing them, and Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, he convinced the government to buy so 51% an ownership share of the company, and transition the Royal Navy to away from coal to fuel. So this became very crucial to the war effort. And then at the end of World War II, Britain is like bankrupt, completely bankrupt. They're losing all the empires, and all the dominions, oh boy. And they get really angry at Mossadegh because he's taking away their oil. And the Americans, the CIA and MI6, they plot a coup and they get rid of him and they reinstall the Shah. The Shah is the monarch, the king. And it's funny because CIA admits to it. You can go look at their documents on their website, but the MI6 still doesn't. It's still secret. But we all know that there was a coup. And that's why the Iranians are very pissed at us, because we meddled in their internal affairs. We stole their resources, and we made them subservient to the United States, to the UK. And so from 1953 to 1979, you have this brutal rule under the Shah and the Savak, his secret police, which are trained by the CIA, of course. And in 1979, there's the Islamic Revolution. And one of the first things they do is they renamed the street where the British embassy was on to dang it, forgive me, I forget his name, but he was basically an Irish guy the British had imprisoned. And then they got rid of the Israeli embassy, broke off ties with Israel, and gave it to the PLO, to the Palestinians. So you have this huge shift, right? There's no more oil for the West. There's no more recognition of Israel. Lots of support for resistance movements and Palestinians. And Iran has been like that ever since. And that doesn't mean it's a perfect country. And there are a lot of things you could criticize, just like with Syria. You can criticize many things. But what annoys me is when people come up with lies, right? Like these chemical attacks in Syria, which didn't happen. There's a difference between making a valid criticism and coming up with a lie.
Right.
Lies can't be tolerated. And when it comes to Iran, because Iran is supporting Yemen, the Houthis, is supporting Lebanon with Hezbollah, is supporting Hamas, supporting Venezuela, supporting Syria, has ties with Russia and China. That's why they're trying to get rid of the government there. They don't like Iran's foreign policy, so they're trying to do regime change. And that doesn't mean necessarily that the government didn't do anything wrong. Again, I don't know, but it is disingenuous to every time there's a crisis in a country to go there and try to use that crisis and exploit that to install a new government. And they've been doing that for ages. Obama, this video where he came out last week talking about, oh, I wish I'd done more. He was talking about 2009 when there were people contesting the election. Now, what the State Department did back then, because he's lying, man. He says, oh, I wish I'd done more. He did plenty. He got the State Department, which is under his direction, to go and get Twitter not to do any maintenance, because websites, they do maintenance, they go offline for a few hours and come back, and the White House and the State Department said that would be too it's too important to have Twitter go offline. Twitter needs to be online the whole day so people in Iran can use it to organize protests, to contest the election and get rid of that government. And we saw that in the Arab Spring, by the way. They used Twitter and Facebook and so on. And so he says, I wish I didn't do enough. No, he did plenty. And you can see, again, big tech and the government, this fusion in pursuit of aggressive foreign policy. And the Iran deal, I mean, look, obviously, if the Iran deal, I've been covering that on the ground, and I've interviewed the Iranian chief negotiator, who's the deputy foreign minister. I interviewed the Russian ambassador. So these are the guys that are in the room. They're the ones leading the talk. And the situation here is basically stalemate, because they were very close to signing it, but then the war in Ukraine started. And I know they like to blame this on Russia, and they say that, Russia told Iran not to sign the deal because this would benefit Russia in terms of monopolizing oil and gas flow into Europe, right? Because if Iran if the deal is back and Iran can sell its oil on the market, that would calm global oil prices and so on. But I don't agree with that 100%. I'm sure they talked about it, but I don't know if that's the only reason, because Iran had a lot of things that needed to be ironed out with the deal. One of them is Trump designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist entity. And that's bizarre, because the IRGC are part of the Iranian armed forces, right? The United States, to my knowledge, has never in history designated another country's army or a branch of another country's army as a terrorist entity. So, obviously with sanctions, this means that they can do anything they like to hurt Iran. They can block the banks, which they did. They blocked the oiling sector, so they cut revenue to Iran. Oil production, oil exports were cut in half since the sanctions were imposed by Trump. And Iran has all these barrels in reserve, just waiting. And I'll give you guys another reminder. Like Biden last year, he literally banned. Not banned, he just stole my television program and everybody else at Press TV and like 30 other outlets. They stole the website. They stole presstv.com. If you type presstv.com, you'll see a US government sign there that they've seized the website. And Biden used the sanctions against the IRGC to do that, which is insane. It's like he's saying Press TV is under the Revolutionary Guard Corps or something. And it once again shows you Biden and Trump are like this, no difference in policy, right? He's using a Trump sanction to hurt Iran. So you see how diverse these sanctions can be used. You can just say, oh, that's the IRGC, and then ban it, and then everybody else globally can't use it or interact with it. So right now we have 2009, before that 1953. Every couple of years they'll try and screw with Iran. 2019 they did it too, and now in 2022 this is another iteration of that, where they're trying to exploit a crisis in the country to enact regime change. And they did this in Syria in 2011. There were reports that the government had shot dead protesters. And they didn't tell you, of course, that policemen were also shot and killed, which is happening in Iran as well, right? And I'm not saying I'm a fan of the police, but I'm just saying that you have to take both sides into account to get a full picture, right? So they're using a tragedy that may have actually happened to pursue regime change. And that is what we have to be critical of. That's what we have to look out for, because, when there were George Floyd protests in the US, I don't recall the Iranian foreign ministry, putting sanctions on America, on the United States, or, sanctioning the United States for selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, where they're using those weapons to commit genocide in Yemen. I don't recall the Iranian foreign ministry calling for regime change in America when you had George Floyd protests. And those protests were far bigger. And you got far more evidence on video of police brutality. I can't even count the number of videos where you see a black man getting shot, people just being beaten for no reason, someone having a mental health crisis, being killed. There are so many videos, from body cam, dash cam, cell phone footage,
police vehicles running over protesters.
The NYPD, that I can't get that out of my head. They literally ran people over. Was it in Times Square or something?
It was
just in broad daylight. They get away with the wildest crap, and no one says, "Oh, it's time for regime change." Let people protest, man. Let them protest and voice their concerns without getting in the middle. It's not their business. So that's what we have to look out for and pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, those are all important points. There's always just blatant lies, cooked up lies from the U.S., its allies, the intelligence services, the CIA. There's always these cooked up lies that are meant to justify the interference aspect of it, the war that does come, and it's a propaganda war, and I think it's really important to highlight this. And I hope we can spend maybe 30 minutes. There's two more things I want to cover. If we can close off this stream next 30 minutes, there's a really important development that happened that I think shows how it's. I mean, to me, it's not that important in terms of the broader things, but it says a lot about what the U.S., what the this alliance of empires is doing to try to do the same thing to China. So China had its 20th CPC National Congress.
All right.
It
Yeah.
just closed. It lasted a week from the Sunday before this one into this past weekend. They elected a new central committee. Xi Jinping is the general secretary for a third 5-year term. And of course, the Western media went into overdrive, demonizing China, demonizing China. There's
I saw that, yeah.
a really strange. So this is, I think the American empire, all of its vassals, are becoming really desperate because there was a really strange story going on. I want to show people how strange the story was about. So Hu Jintao, he was the general secretary of the Communist Party. He was also the president of China from 2002 to 2012. And during the Congress, there was a very interesting story that circulated. I just want to share what the New York Times had to say, but it was viral, right? Everyone was talking about Hu Jintao, and here you see it. You know, the former Chinese leader was escorted out without explanation. He appeared to pause to speak to Xi Jinping before leaving. And so here is the video. I'll just turn off you don't need to hear the volume on this. You can just see he looks a little bit confused. They're trying to get him out. And it seems like a pretty non-eventful thing. You have no idea what's going on, but it doesn't seem like a crisis. No one else is reacting. Xi Jinping is pretty much chilling there. So yeah. So that happened, right? He was escorted out. This young man who's helping him, obviously. There you go. You see him. He's walking out. The media jumped on this and said, "Oh my gosh, this is an unprecedented level of repression. We've never seen anything quite like this before." Now, this would be the highest official to be purged or to be subject to the anti-corruption campaign. And then I just want to show a quick rebuttal to this, just to show you how ridiculous this all was. So Hu Jintao was not purged. He wasn't being repressed. He wasn't being subject to the anti-corruption campaign. He actually returned and voted after having a rest. There was a lot of speculation that he might not have been feeling well. And here you see the video. Let me just rewind. There he is voting. He's there. And then it says that he returned to vote. It's up to you whether you trust him or not. But nonetheless, he wasn't purged. He returned after what a lot of people are saying in China, media. He wasn't feeling well. And that's that. But again, this was going viral, and it was going viral to smear China and to make China out to be, especially Xi Jinping, just the most repressive figure we could ever, similar to Iran, right? Look at how repressive Iran is. Here's this video of a woman collapsing in a police station, and then they don't tell you that actually the rioters in Iran have killed more security forces than than police forces have harmed protesters. Like they don't tell you that. Similar in China, it's like, oh, look how repressive they are toward Hu Jintao. They don't tell you that in Hong Kong, more police officers died than police harmed Hong Kong protesters when there was that color revolution happening. So anyway, any reactions to the Hu Jintao situation? I just want to know what you think about that, because it's so utterly what it is. Ridiculous.
I knew it. Like they're trying to portray it like like the Stasi walked in and just like took him to a station somewhere and tortured him and purged him from the party. It's they try to like make these cartoon villains out of any foreign leader they don't like, and I find it so infantile, and it's insulting. Like, people in the West allow their media to speak and leaders to speak to them like they're children and dumb things down to a binary level, and they do this with Russia right now too. Like, oh, Putin he's an imperialist. Apparently he wants the Soviet Union back. He wants to take over the whole world. He just wants to raise gas prices in the US to make you suffer, like all this crazy cartoon villain nonsense. And they don't say anything about NATO. They don't say anything about how Russians have been opposed to NATO expansion since before anyone even heard of Vladimir Putin. And it's the same thing with China, right? They always show you one side, they don't tell you the full story. And the second video that you played, I can I can damn well assure you they're not going to make that one go viral, because that breaks the whole story, right? Like, let's just think about this for a second. If China actually wanted to quote unquote purge him like they're claiming, why would they do that when there are cameras rolling in front of everyone? Like
the media and
the Chinese
2,296 delegates of the Communist Party of China all sitting in the same Great Hall of the People. Yes, it's very strange.
No, then they say it was to send a message because they're evil, you know, like, now this is ridiculous. And I saw, you know, you're having a choir jump in now against China. Like you mentioned Liz Truss earlier, you know, they're saying China's the biggest threat that we have in the world. You know, they're saying that Xi Jinping is some evil guy. I saw some headline earlier. Forgive me, I don't know if it was New York Times or it was one of the American outlets, and they were saying that how he's dangerous and his third term is solidifying his iron rule over China. So, like, what does that mean, man? What does that mean? Why don't you talk about how we got a guy who's prime minister in the UK who wasn't even fucking elected? You want to talk about, like, you know, weird political systems? Why don't you look in the West first? That Rishi Sunak wasn't even elected by the British people or his own party. He just got the job. And we have a new king, apparently. Like, who are these people? Who are these people? No one voted for them. We're supposed to pay for their shit and bow down to them, and we're a democracy? Forget China, man. Like, look at yourself and your allies, you know? That's why I find it incredible how, you know, the people are in the West are always more concerned with democracy, like, overseas than in their own backyard. And with China, man, they're just jealous and they're desperate, like you said, because the revival of the New Silk Road. I mean, this is something incredible. You know, I've been to Palmyra in Syria, which is an ancient city, thousands of years old, and it used to be a very important stop on the Silk Road, which ran, as you know, all the way from China to basically the Middle East and Europe, and it was the major trading route of the time. One of the biggest, I mean, probably the most infamous trade route in history. And China's trying to revive that. And they're doing, I love that. I love this because Syria is part of it. So that means Palmyra will be part of it. Iran has joined up. Cuba has joined up. Venezuela. And it's not just, you know, people want to say, oh, it's just, you know, the evil countries, of course, you know, and they say, oh, it's global South. They say that to kind of try and denigrate it or make it look like it's irrelevant, but it's very relevant. If it weren't important, why would they be trying to chip away at China so bad and to discredit the Belt and Road Initiative? They're scared, man, because, you know, this war in Ukraine is a catalyst. And I don't think, like, tomorrow morning, you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and the dollar's going to disappear or something. And you know, China's going to be king. But the war in Ukraine has sped up this process. It's certainly accelerated it because they've basically almost quite literally burnt any bridges between Russia and Europe, with Nord Stream 2 being blown up, the Crimea Bridge being blown up. You know, they escalated the war. They really escalated that, and cutting off Russian energy. So Russia is going to turn east, right? They have the power of Siberia pipelines. They have so much, like I said, they have the biggest gas reserves on Earth. And China started paying Russia in rubles for gas. I mean, this is crazy. Even Saudi Arabia is looking at this and going, you know what, we're not so crazy about you. And they've asked to join the BRICS, right? So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa,
Yes.
the emerging
Saudi
economy.
Arabia, yes.
Saudi Arabia, man, who would have thought, right? Who would have thought? So I think that's very, very bad for the U.S. And of course, tomorrow morning, MBS could have a change of heart and, you know, become their darling again. I know how this works, but it's still unprecedented that the Saudis basically give the Americans the finger when they need oil desperately in a moment like this. It doesn't happen usually. Even the UAE. And that's why Biden's reevaluating the relationship. And so you see everything is gravitating towards the East now. And this is good for the global South. It's good for people who've been living under the jackboot of European capitalism, imperialism for centuries. And I don't know, I can't say for sure whether the new multipolar world is going to be perfect or even good. But this current one, it cannot last because it is evil, and all we see is war, sanctions, destruction, misery. It's just a cycle, and there's no way out of it. And you know, when it comes to China, China's trying to promote there's mutual respect and agreement. It's not we're going to storm your country with with paratroopers and steal your resources and put in a new government. It's do you want to do a trade? Like, do you agree that we give you this and you give us that? Iran can't sell oil because of sanctions. So the deal is Iran gives the Chinese oil, China builds infrastructure in return. This is respectful. This is something based on mutual agreement and respect, and that's what the world needs. And their efforts to try to discredit China, discredit Iran, it's not a coincidence. It's not. They are getting nervous and they're getting desperate, and they will do this to justify any future sanctions or interventions. And I'm afraid that Taiwan is going to be the next Ukraine. You're going to have, because like I said, they're trying to chip away at China with Tibet, with Hong Kong, with Xinjiang, with Xinjiang, with the Uyghurs, and Taiwan is probably going to be their next one. I hope I'm wrong, but seeing the stuff like AUKUS, this military alliance with Australia, the UK, the US, that's provocative. You put nuclear powered, not armed, but still nuclear powered advanced submarines in Australia's hands and tell the Australians, there's the enemy, it's the Chinese. How is that not provocation? Like, they always want to portray the West as the victim, but if you just look at a map, it's Western forces that encircle China. It's Western forces that encircle Iran. The map is very clear. The map doesn't lie.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the conversations about an Asian NATO, about NATO now in this last summit, in their strategic, whatever it's called, their strategic document, to saying China is now added onto the list as a top threat. And NATO, NATO is the nuclear proliferator right now, especially with regard to this Ukraine crisis. It is what even some mainstream media is talking about, a big fear about, well, what if a nuclear war were to come about? What if Article 5 of NATO's illegitimate constitution was triggered? Like, what would happen? And so, I think that's a very legitimate point. And for me, with respect to the CPC National Congress and why this Hu Jintao story and all of these ridiculous propaganda points became so intense, is because the desperation is very real. I mean, when you think about just the instability of Europe's political situation, coupled on with the United States itself. I mean, Joe Biden, not very popular at the moment. And the midterm elections are looking incredibly fragile. We're talking about probably a transition. Republicans may get a slight majority. Maybe they'll get a bigger majority afterward. But it's really the feeling around it, the popular sentiment around it. It's very, very, very low. Ordinary people are not talking about the midterms. The mainstream media and the politicians, they're talking about it nonstop. But I think also the CPC National Congress, similar to what you were saying, is like there is this vision being laid out. It's being solidified, and it's something that's it's very vocal. It
scares the crap out of the West.
It's a 5-year kind of both review of what's happened. They were reviewing what's happened over the last decade, the achievements, all of that. Forget that China has eradicated extreme poverty, a historic achievement. Forget about China's economic growth, even during a pandemic. Forget that China is also, starting to lead the way and has been leading the way for quite a bit of time in very important high-tech arenas and also renewable energy. Forget all of that. But it's also what you said, Richard. It's this this global vision that I think is really frightening, because you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road. You have 140 countries already signed on to that. You have thousands of projects underway, and many more and many of those have been completed. And this is a very real development. Even the World Bank has had to concede, just in transportation infrastructure. Things like railways, like what they've built in Laos, the high-speed railway, what they've built in Pakistan, the Lahore metro. Those things alone is going to reduce poverty, eliminate extreme poverty, reduce moderate levels of poverty for millions of people, like just that alone. Yep. And so that's not even all of it. I mean, this is a maritime policy. This is this is a broad vision of development, mutual development, that that is centered on the global south, but China has done something very smart, and I think also scares the United States and its allies, is they've said no one is excluded from this. You're not excluded from this. You can exclude yourself. Biden, he can sanction chips, he can sanction renewable energy products, like polysilicon, raw materials like that. You can do that, but we're not asking you to do that. We're not telling you to do that. We're actually saying, join us. You can join us if you want. And that also is a public relations nightmare. So China has to look like this dog, right? This like absolute rabid dog. It can't control itself, even in all the nice suits, all of the the Great Hall of the People. It looks beautiful, but they can't even treat Hu Jintao, right? It's this incredibly racist caricature that they have to promote in order to make China look bad, because they can't really do it in any other way.
They can't. And what you just said, like, China is not even just like shutting out anyone. China's saying like, come join us. And it's so embarrassing for the US because, they can't save face. They have to like come up with something. I think there's a phrase like embarrassing someone with kindness. I think that applies here, because China is not being hostile or saying we are going to be the leaders, our world order. You remember Bush at the turn of the millennium. He was like, there's a new world order. And there was a sentiment after the Cold War that, okay, Russia lost. America is now not a superpower. It's a hyperpower. And there, it's a word, it will become law. China is not doing that. China is, like you said, being all inclusive, and they don't know how to handle that. So again, they default back to demonization. And you mentioned Lahore. That's very great to hear. I went to Lahore when I was a child, when I was living in Pakistan, and it's very, very beautiful. So Pakistan is undergoing its own dirty war, I would say, right now, because they ousted Imran Khan, who's the prime minister. He's the most popular. I don't know. Look, man, I'm really not exaggerating when I say I think he's one of the most popular politicians, not in Pakistan only, but worldwide. Like, if you look at the rallies that this guy whips up, like in Karachi, in Islamabad, in Lahore, they're so big, they're so ridiculously huge. You think Biden could draw a crowd like that? Just once, one crowd? This guy does it every night. And that's why they bugged his home, they bugged his office. They had a couple of people from the coalition defect to the opposition and vote against him. Like, this guy got ousted by 5 MPs. Like, that's it. The people want him. The people want him. He's extremely popular. He used to be a cricket player, and now he was prime minister for a couple of years. He was very vocal against the war on terror. He said, we helped America. What did we get in return? They killed thousands of Pakistanis with drones, of course, and they just used the country as a staging ground against Afghanistan. And the day that the war in Ukraine started, Imran Khan was in Moscow. So, that was like seen as, okay, you crossed the line. You're not only refusing to sanction Russia, but you're buying wheat and buying gas in person in the Kremlin. And he had to go. And he was very clear, Imran Khan. He said, this is from the Americans. They sent a letter through the foreign service, the Pakistani foreign service, basically threatening him that, walk quietly or we'll get rid of you another way. And people said, oh, this letter is fake. And if it was real, he would have published it. And I'll just remind people that the High Court in Pakistan classified the letter. So if it's fake, why would they classify a fake letter? The US wanted him gone, and his rivals in Pakistan wanted him gone. Like I said, he's too popular and they can't contain him. And so now he's been barred. Just yesterday, he's been barred from running for office again, because they are afraid of him winning the next election, which he would in a landslide. And they even charged him with terrorism. They said, oh, you're violating the Constitution. You're a terrorist. They're like, what? Unbelievable. So I went off on a little tangent, but just to go back, I was with I was with Julian Assange's father the other day. We were doing a Q&A at this movie premiere of Ithaca, which is about the family, like, internal viewpoint of trying to get Julian free. And it's a very touching movie. And someone asked at this Q&A, like, they basically asked, like, are you optimistic about anything? Because the world looks really chaotic and etc. And I said, no, not really. And then John Shipton, Julian's father, he said that he mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, and he mentioned basically he alluded to multipolar world, and he's right. He's right that is something. There is at least one positive thing happening right now, and it's that it's the multipolar world, the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm glad he said that, because even though I know it, I didn't think to connect the dots, because everything does look very grim most of the time. But it's when you have empires that are failing or drowning or going down and becoming irrelevant, that's perhaps when they're the most desperate. And I think that might be what we're seeing now. And I don't know how long it's going to take. I would certainly hope that no one suffers, because they're, like you alluded to, they're normalizing World War III. Like that's the even Biden is saying this is the most dangerous. We're the closest to Armageddon that we've ever been since 1962, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's right in that regard, but he's also, partially to blame. And I find it incredible that no one in the U.S. Congress, from AOC to the furthest of right in the GOP, has said anything about diplomacy. They're all talking about sending more weapons, and they vote for more weapons, and you have like a handful of voices. I don't even know who, honestly. They're not that loud, calling for diplomacy. They're just in unison. And as you know, Danny, like the Democratic Party is right wing. So honestly, like of course there's no difference. But it's just interesting that these supposed progressives and people who like pretended to be anti-war, like AOC and Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar, they literally sent weapons to Israel. Ilhan Omar. Do you remember how they called her anti-Semitic and they crapped all over her? And she gave them weapons, and now they're giving weapons to Ukraine, and people like to portray that as aid. It's not aid. You're just transferring cash into American companies that build bombs that make a living killing. So, there's no hope in that regard. There are no anti-war voices, and that's scandalous. That's its own scandal.
Right.
That town hall where AOC was calling someone rude, I forget their names, but there are two very brave guys who confronted her about her votes, and she said, "You're rude." She always deflects, right? This is what people do in general when they can't negotiate obstacles with you in terms of politics. When they don't know how to respond, they immediately start name calling, insulting, changing the subject. They do anything to take focus away from the politics, from the topic, because they cannot win the argument and they have no moral ground to stand on.
And they don't want to talk about the issue. They don't want to. I mean, they don't want to talk about Ukraine in a real way. They want it to be siloed. They want it to be managed. They want it to be focus grouped. They want it to be something that they can control, because it's midterm election season. Even before midterm election season, there are certain questions. There are certain policies. You can't really question if you want to be in DC. If you want to be in the Democratic Party, you can't oppose Pelosi and Schumer and all in the establishment on their subservience and their diligent service to the war machine. You just can't do it, and they don't do it. Yeah. I wanted to bring up one last thing, because I think it's really important. You mentioned Julian Assange. Julian Assange is a really good example of what happens. One of the reasons we don't have, I think, anti-war voices, it's not the only reason, but it is a big one, is that people like Julian Assange himself, they are punished. They are repressed, right? We talk about authoritarianism. I mean, look at what is going on. Look what is happening to Julian Assange. But even people like Jeffrey Sachs, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, he is an economist. He is someone who has been very vocal against what's happening in Ukraine. He's also been someone who has been very fair on China, right? And talking and opposing this new Cold War on China. I want to play just a short clip from a Twitter thread. I'm not going to play all the clips, but there's one that I think
I know which one.
that you can only say certain things. This is at the Athens Democracy Forum, which is sponsored by the New York Times. It's a big foundation. I want to scroll down to the clip that's going viral right now, where Jeffrey Sachs basically just is telling the truth, but he is shut down pretty quickly. Here's what he had to say, and I want your reaction, Richard.
The ledger. And one more point I want to make about democracy, because we're in a democracy forum where we we treat democracy as the good. The most violent country in the world in the 19th century, by far, was perhaps the most democratic or second most democratic, and that was Britain. You can be democratic at home and ruthlessly imperial abroad. The most violent country in the world since 1950 has been the United States. It's
Jeff,
been by far involved
Jeffrey,
in more,
stop
wait a
now.
minute, in more
Let's
wars.
Jeffrey. I'm Jeffrey. I'm your moderator, and it's enough.
Okay, I'm done.
Oh, Jeffrey, go to your room immediately.
Jeffrey. I mean, could it be any more? And he had spoken for a few minutes before that, but it was only like, I think, a total of 5 minutes. I don't want to play the whole thing because the whole copyright thing, but on YouTube, but it was 5 minutes.
Treated him
Not
like a child.
Yes, but Jeffrey, like, I mean, this is Jeffrey Sachs has done a lot in his career as an economist. He's consulted for many different politicians and various very influential political figures all across the world. And this is how he's treated when he says what he said. Anyway, your reaction.
Well, like, man, they treated him like a child. They had to shut him up because, you know, this is the infamous free speech of the West. You start speaking the truth and they'll shut you down, right? So that was I get what he was saying. I mean, I don't really view the UK as democratic because we have like I said, an unelected king. I have no clue who this guy is. He's my king, apparently. We have a prime minister. I also have no clue who he is, unelected by his party and the British people. So unelected kings, unelected prime ministers, and we have journalists in high security prisons. So yeah, very democratic. You know, I understand his point though, because some people want to believe that the U.S. is democratic, or that the UK is democratic, and if you want to believe that, okay, but it's not true. And you know, his point is very valid. You know, you can be a democracy at home or pretend to be a democracy at home and still screw people overseas and kill them and make their lives hell and subjugate them. And that is what the UK did in India. And what you had basically 25% of both the world's landmass and world population under British rule at the height of the British Empire. That's not even 150 years ago. Not even. So, you know, the US has now basically taken over. I think you could say since the Suez Canal crisis, you know, the French and British were kind of shown to be like these irrelevant powers, and it was the U.S. which is now in control. You know, for various factors, of course, you know, having all these military bases, you know, Africa, I think 51 out of 54 African countries have either U.S. military bases or military attaches, which basically you can just call a U.S. military presence. So they have AFRICOM, which is dominating that continent, the entire continent, and they have the biggest drone base. I think it's where was it again? Is it in Niger? I don't remember which country it's in. It might be in Niger, but it's ridiculously big and secret. And I bet you most people in America don't even know it exists. And it costs, you know, like tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to build. And they use Djibouti, you know, for medevac, if I'm not mistaken. They also have other bases there, and the whole Horn of Africa. You know, why are they letting the Saudis screw Yemen, and why are they in Somalia and Djibouti? Because this is the most important shipping lane on Earth. All of the oil comes through here. All of the trade comes through here. You know, they want to control the Gulf of Aden, the Gulf of Oman, and you know, the vital economic routes. And one of the ways they do this, of course, is with their military bases. And oftentimes they do this by force, and other times they'll bribe officials there or you know, leverage something against them in order to get the base there. And that's very undemocratic. It's very authoritarian and aggressive. And you know, I don't think most people understand that or want to understand that, but they should. They have to understand what European powers have done overseas, and what the United States is doing now overseas. You know, a lot of these countries are now so-called democracies. Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, France, Portugal, Spain, the US, but their behavior overseas is not. You know, like, believe they're democratic all you want, but their behavior overseas was genocide, was plundering. and it still continued. I don't agree that decolonization, maybe it started in 1945, but it certainly didn't end. They talk about it like it finished or something once India became independent. And no, that's not true. If you go to Niger, there, that was under French colonization, and it still is, because they have 70% of electricity in France, is powered by nuclear. Okay, so 70% of France's electricity comes from nuclear, and they get the uranium for that from Niger. People in Niger don't have any infrastructure. They don't have. They're not reaping any benefits from this deal with the French. So now, instead of the French government doing it or the French army, you have a French multinational, which now has been nationalized anyway, in Niger, still exerting influence from l'Élysée, from Paris onto Niger, still plundering that country, and this disgusting imbalance. It's not like it's a fair deal. No, it's exploitation. So and Charles de Gaulle, the French president, he was adamant about this, about maintaining French influence in Africa. And to this day, you have so many countries that have French currency that's minted in France. The CFA franc. It's 14 African countries. So you can say France is democratic, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but it's rubbish. They don't even apply it at home, never mind overseas. So this is an important myth to dispel, and I'm glad Jeffrey Sachs said it, because you still have people who might not believe that their countries are they think their countries are infallible. Well, I hate to break it to you, but they aren't, and they commit a lot of atrocities, and they still are. We're in a neo-colonial period. It's still ongoing, and it's the same actors doing it to the same countries in your name. So if you care about democracy like you claim, then actually apply that and look at the behavior and examine it, and don't swallow the propaganda that they spread in Western press and Western institutions and colleges. There's a whole system designed to make people ignorant about what their governments are doing overseas, and that has to be broken. It has to be broken.
Yeah. I mean, agreed with your point about what Jeffrey Sachs said. I mean, yeah, I would with the caveat, just very similar to what you're saying, is that you could say that Britain and then now the United States, you could, if you want to call them democracies, I'd like to think of more of how Lenin would describe the democracies here. It's democracies for the rich, right? It is it's their dictatorship, but it's very democratic for them because they make the decisions. They have the power. They are able to do things like the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and also exploit people at home, be able to enrich themselves, exploit workers, exploit ordinary people within their own borders.
Just like Israel's democratic, but as long as you're a Jewish settler,
Yeah, exactly, right. An apartheid, a so-called apartheid democracy, you could call it. And I think it's important to point out those contradictions. But Jeffrey Sachs, you could tell what he was doing. He was trying to get this message out in a way that the Athens Democracy Forum could handle that message. And even then, the moderator had to say, oh, no. Didn't you see the New York Times label up there? We do not say these things in the New York Times. So that means you can't say it either.
Yeah. So much for free speech, right? Like they always say that it's China and Iran and Syria and all these like evil quote unquote countries that are undemocratic and authoritarian and don't allow dissent. But it's really in the West. And I that video you played is one iteration of that. And I've seen firsthand in the courtroom, a British judge like basically rubber stamping. He even said it in so many words. It's like, there's nothing I can really do now. I'm just sending this to the Home Secretary. Do you understand that you are now going to be extradited to the US? And that's the journalist being threatened with 175 years, and 17 of the 18 counts are for espionage. So talk about authoritarian. That's like a textbook case of locking up dissenters. You just call them spies. And I don't know anyone in China or Iran or Syria who's been given 175 years or threatened with that, or like dragged from another continent, to be put in jail for dissenting. What's funny? I'll tell you something, man. Assange, if I'm not mistaken, it was WikiLeaks, right? So Assange's so his company, not company, but publishing house that he created, right? So WikiLeaks published the emails of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president. And, you know, it's funny because there's nothing really in there. I think there's some stuff about them buying chandeliers or something, but like, you know, not, you compare that to the American ones with like drone striking children. I mean, you know, so much for the evil narrative. But you know, the Syrian government didn't start saying, okay, we want to extradite this guy and put him in jail because he published our emails. You know, on the contrary, they actually support him. Food for thought. Just food for thought.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I think this is a great place to close our stream, because it's exactly this kind of hypocrisy which makes it just so critical to expose these very crimes. I mean, the war criminality, the war propaganda. I said in the title here, you know, there's Putin's curse happening to the West, to the United States. We could have said Assad's curse as well, right? There's Assad's. I mean, the blowback is very real, but it's all based in the war criminal. It's basically war criminality now creating the conditions for the crumbling of this global system of empire led by the US and by, of course, the UK as its top junior partner. And so I'm really appreciative, Richard, for you taking your time out here. Before we head out, because we're going to head out together, I will just say, you know, keep liking the video, keep subscribing to the channel. Of course, support this channel. You can become a member of the YouTube. You can go to Rockfin, leave a tip at the left lens, and you can also become a member on Patreon. You can find all those links in the description. Where can people find you, Richard, before we head out?
YouTube.com/Richard Medhurst. If you go on Twitter and just type twitter.com/Richie Medhurst, RICHI, and richardmedhurst.com, you'll find all my links. I'm on YouTube, Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, Telegram, whatever, you name it. You'll find the links on youtube.com/Richard Medhurst. And Danny, thank you so much for having me. Really, like I like I said, I was dying to get this out about Sunak and all these other topics. So this is very therapeutic. And I appreciate it so much.
Well, I'm glad. Well, we'll have to do it again soon. Yes. Check out his links in the description. You can check out the links in the description here. That's how you support independent media that's actually focusing on anti-imperialism. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic. But anyway, thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in today. And I will be back with you all very soon. Have a good